I'd like to call to order the Planning Commission meeting of May 28th, 2025. Christina, would you please call the roll?
Okay, Chair Mitchell,
Here.
Vice Chair Najak,
Here.
Commissioner Moreno,
Here.
Commissioner Sly,
Here.
Commissioner Bruce,
Here.
and Commissioner Rigby and Tuing are absent tonight.
Thank you. The item number 3 next on the agenda is the City Council update. Christina, do we have City Council on Zoom? No.
We do not.
Thank you. Item number 4 on the agenda tonight is the approval of the minutes from our last meeting on April 28th, 2025, a copy of which the commissioners received earlier. Are there any revisions to the minutes, proposed minutes, or comments? Otherwise, do we have a motion?
I'll make a motion to approve the minutes as written.
Second? Okay, thank you. I guess all those in favor say aye. Aye.
Aye.
Anyone oppose? Okay. Thank you. That takes us on to item number 5 on the agenda for public comment. Christina, do we have anyone that wishes to provide public comment or raise an issue regarding items not on the agenda this evening?
None tonight.
Thank you. Item number 6 is the general updates for the Commission for Citizen Involvement, and I have one update here from the North Shore Country Club District Neighborhood Association. Their annual meeting will be held Sunday, June 1st, 2025 at 6:30 p.m. social, followed by a presentation at 7 p.m. This will be held at the Oswego Heritage House, 398 10th Street, and the presentation will be on resources for aging in place. And then a brief meeting and the election of the Neighborhood Association Board will follow the presentation. Okay, that brings us to item number 7 on the agenda, the work session. This is in relation to the Housing Needs and Production Strategies work session. The Housing Production Strategy is PP 22-0005, and this will include a discussion of a bunch of projects. I don't think I need to list them all out. And Staff Coordinator Erik Olson, Long Range Planning Manager, will take us through them.
All right, thank you, Chair Mitchell, and thank you, commissioners, for being here. I think it might have seemed like a weighty agenda item at first, but I'm hoping to make it relatively smooth and not too time-consuming, at least for you all. So anyways, just that's my intent, at least. Generally speaking, as you just heard from Chair Mitchell, we are going to be discussing sort of different implementation updates really for the different strategies in the housing production strategy and just kind of what has happened since we last spoke. So I'll go over a little bit of the background for those that weren't really closely involved with the development of the housing production strategy, talk a bit about the letter of approval from DLCD and some of the conditions of approval that were issued, and then provide some implementation updates for each of the strategies that we were expected to sort of take on either last year or start this year. So yeah, I will be concluding with just a really quick summary of next steps. As many of you are aware, but perhaps not everyone, but basically, we developed the housing production strategy based on some state requirements under Oregon statewide planning goal 10, as well as through House Bill 2001 or HB 2001 from 2019. Essentially, recent requirements from the state require cities over 10,000 in population to both complete an H&A or a housing needs analysis every 6 to 8 years to sort of determine what housing is needed for current and future residents, as well as a housing production strategy to identify strategies to address those needs that were identified. So really that's what we're responding to here in terms of the city's response. We adopted a updated housing needs analysis. We had originally adopted one in 2013. So this is a sort of 2023 housing needs analysis that was passed in October 2023. And we adopted within a year, roughly a year afterwards, we adopted a housing production strategy with some strategies that we wanted to use to meet those needs. So luckily for us, we were issued a letter of approval by the State Department of Land Conservation and Development, or DLCD. The approval, though, went along with 5 conditions of approval that applied to the city as we kind of pursue these conditions. Generally speaking, there was a sort of concern from DLCD that some of the strategies were written sort of in an open-ended fashion and didn't include specific commitments. Of course, this is relatively deliberate on the part of the city not to commit to too much and to leave things relatively open-ended. But there were conditions, particularly numbers 1 and 5, that were related to monitoring and implementation. Really just saying, with respect to the annual summaries, we will submit those at the 3-year midpoint. So we don't have to do those every year, but we have to include sort of an annual assessment of our progress. Condition 1 is really about measuring the sort of implementation progress through the identified sort of recommendations or actions or considerations that were included in the report. So just some guidance from DLCD on how they will measure our progress. Condition 2 is really more directly related to the rezone land strategy and requires the city to essentially quantify the added capacity that we expect a rezoning to bring to the city. So really to develop not only a methodology to show that and sort of talk about the methodology itself, but also to demonstrate that added capacity at the midpoint report again. And when I say midpoint report, that's sort of the 3-year, so it's a 6-year cycle. So the 3-year midpoint for us would be, because it was adopted in 2024, 2027. The end of 2027 is the midpoint report. The end of the cycle is 2030. Condition 3 relates more to the public-private partnership strategy. This is one of the more nebulous strategies, I think, that we included in the housing production strategy, but it's also kind of difficult, as I'll explain later, for the city to initiate some of this. But nonetheless, the city has been conditioned to take formal action to initiate or advance at least one of 4 steps that we included as potential recommendations for public-private partnerships. So really trying to put a little bit more teeth into some of the more exploratory language that was included in the HPS originally. And condition 4 relates to our tax increment financing strategy, and really mostly is related to asking the city to clarify the scope of the action. So I think, more or less, we'll discuss that a little bit later in the presentation, but that should be relatively easy for us to do. So here you can see the general timeline for how we are proposing to, at least in the HPS, how we propose to go about implementing these strategies. You can see that a number, or at least 2 of them, number 2 and 8, were supposed to be completed last year. And there's a number of other strategies that we're tasked with sort of getting underway with completing this year. So you can see that under kind of 2025 in this graph. And now I'll go on to talk about each of those. So the first one is a big one. It's to conduct a comprehensive review and update the Community Development Code to identify and remove or revise any regulations that constrain housing production, really to go through a process of identifying barriers to development, as well as addressing those barriers through some proposed code amendments to improve our regulations here in the city. We generally expect to be able to begin this very soon. I've started scoping this project already and expect to complete it by the end of 2027. The current plan is to apply for a Metro 2040 Planning and Development Grant soon for the 3rd quarter of 2025. So that's in the next couple months here that we'd have to apply. And ideally, we'd be able to, if approved, issue a request for proposals in fall 2025 and get going with the project kicked off in early 26. So, I think we seem to be relatively on track for that, but there's a lot of steps to get there. So it's likely that we'll come in and chat with you relatively soon, but, sort of during the grant application process, just to give you an update on kind of what the scope includes and talk a little bit more about this project. I think it's worth noting, though, that, in addition to housing, which was identified in the HPS itself as something that we wanted to address barriers to housing, City Council has for a while been hoping that staff had capacity really to take on sort of an audit related to barriers to economic development and business activity. So we are expanding the work in this project to address that, and I think we're going to have to be strategic about how we do each of those things to make sure we're meeting our HPS requirements and not kind of conflating the two things. But regardless, I think I also wanted to point out that it will be necessary to kind of coordinate what we're doing with these code amendments with other code amendments that might be necessary to comply with some of these more recent state mandates from last year related to the mandatory adjustment provisions of Senate Bill 1537, or what we expect to be passed this year with middle housing sort of changes and some other changes that should be notable in House Bill 2138. So again, this is kind of just to make sure that we're not, going out and, trying to do things that we're going to be required to do later by the state in a very sort of deliberate way. So it kind of would be potentially a waste of time to do that. So that's the idea there. In terms of Senate Bill 1537, I just want to provide an update on that. We've been talking about that for, on and off for the last year or so. Just as a reminder, though, it does require local governments to grant up to 10 distinct adjustments to specific development and design standards for housing, as long as the housing meets certain criteria. That criteria includes a requirement that the development be a minimum of 17 units per acre, and that's about 2,500 square feet of lot area per unit. So this is a fairly dense development for what we see in the city, so it's unlikely to apply to a lot of things, but there are a lot of concerns about kind of what this could look like if those adjustments are automatically going to be granted to applicants. So, I think we want to be a little bit, deliberate about how we approach this. So regardless, just to sort of summarize this, we were directed by council to apply for an exemption to these mandatory adjustment provisions last year. And we formally sort of provided our application earlier this year in April. There's a current public comment period that is open right now. It's being reviewed by the new Housing Accountability and Production, I'm just combining things, office, or HOPO, at the state level. It's their new kind of more of a, a regulatory, I guess it's an accountability office is probably basically the best way to explain it, but that is a relatively new body at the state. They will finish their review ideally on or before July 16th, so we'll have a final decision by then. Regardless of whether especially if we don't get the exemption, but even if we do get the exemption, it is likely that we will need to pursue some additional code amendments if that's the sort of direction that council wants to take here, to make sure that we apply with these standards, making sure that we grant those 10 adjustments that we're required to grant all throughout the city in the different zones where we're required to allow it. So more could be coming on that front, but it will be after July 16th that we'll come back and talk about it.
Erik, can I jump and ask you a question? On that last point on the slide about code amendments will likely be needed to fully comply, and you said regardless of whether we get the exception granted or not, we might have to do anything. Can you elaborate on that a little bit? Because the way I read it was like, if we got the exemption, then we don't need to do anything else. So,
I think it's more related to some of our review of the conditions that have applied to other jurisdictions for this approval, and we think that it's likely that, based on what we know about our code and based on what we've seen happening in other jurisdictions, that there will be a lot of things that do comply within our code for the exemption criteria, but a few things that don't, that would require some cleanup. So, the scope of this is yet to be determined, but, I think, again, regardless, even if we get that exemption, we expect that there will be elements of the code that we'll need to go in and clean up, so we'd only be granted it for those items that did not require additional action.
it can be partially granted. That's okay.
And we do have kind of a temporary exemption right now just because we put in this application already.
But if the council directs us to not, because if we don't want to qualify for the exemptions and they say, well, just forget it, we'll just, then we won't have to make any code amendments, but it just depends on the council direction.
Yeah, I mean, it depends on the council direction. I think just if we wanted to comply with these provisions, though, we would have to adopt code amendments.
Okay, thank you.
Either way, if we get the exemption or we don't, but obviously council might have different thoughts on what we should do. Any other questions on SB 1537 mandatory adjustments? Again, we will probably be providing another update later in the year once we know more of these details and get a sense of kind of what we would need to do to comply and whether we'll be directed to do so. This one's a quick one. This is the strategy to really develop regulations that comply with the CFEC rules by either removing parking mandates in certain areas or removing parking mandates citywide. This is something that we reviewed in depth and adopted last year, as you're all aware, at the Planning Commission. Of course, went on to City Council and was adopted. So this is something that, because it was adopted in December 2024, we are on track here, completed this pursuant to what was identified in the implementation timeline. We knew this at the time, of course, that we were going to be able to comply with this, but it just feels good to check something off the list here, and we should note that. Otherwise, let's get going to another big strategy here, the rezone land strategy. This is another one that will have a lot of kind of implications, and that we're trying to be a little bit deliberate in how we approach it. And that will require some funding, outside funding. So, our strategy here is to rezone commercial or other non-residentially zoned properties to allow for housing development, especially multifamily. Generally speaking, this was initially conceived as a project that would also involve a later phase that would look at non-residential zone, or I'm sorry, that would move on from non-residential zones to look at residential zones. But some of the timing of the grant application and the guidance from DLCD complicates our ability to complete that as we initially proposed in the HPS. So kind of based on some of the guidance from DLCD, which was specifically to consider using this planning assistance grant, we've started to modify the schedule a bit here and want to tie a little bit more to that grant cycle. So anyway, we're scoping that project now as well, similar to the code audit strategy, and we'll be applying for a grant from DLCD instead of Metro for this work. They do these planning assistance grants in 2-year cycles, so we are actually right on target, hopefully, for the 2025-2027 cycle. It's notable here that we could actually use either a DLCD appointed consultants. They have sort of a roster of consultants that we could use that they have sort of already vetted and have on, I guess, retainer, maybe you'd call it. I'm not sure exactly what the relationship is, but that's maybe the best way to explain it. Or we could, initiate our own RFP process. So we're trying to figure out which would be the most time-effective way to go about this. Relatively speaking, though, we have committed to completing this by the end of 2028. That should not be an issue, but I think we're just kind of thinking differently about how to go about it. So our current thought is to really develop some alternatives that the city could look at and focus a lot more on different areas of the city that we will then drill in on later in the process, but to at least outline those alternatives and outline that methodology to quantify how we're going to measure this added residential capacity. And we should be able to do that before the end of 2026. And then, that will allow us to then sort of select focus areas and then draft and eventually hopefully adopt amendments for those areas by the end of 2027. So this is all kind of focused on the non-residential components. I think it's extremely likely that we'll be able to take on a lot of our capacity through the non-residential areas and adding capacity there, as opposed to looking at existing sort of single family to high density residential zones. Typically the higher density residential zones are mixed use zones anyway and would be included in this scope here. So anyway, I think the idea is that we're trying to deliberately take on the portion of the rezoning that we expect to get the most impact out of in this sort of time period before 2027. So that's kind of what we're thinking for the rezone land strategy. There's a lot of work that we still have to do to scope this work, and some answers that we still have to answer at DLCD, or some questions that we have to answer there. So I think there will be a lot of updates for you later this year. I'm not exactly sure when we're going to come back and discuss this, but it will be not too long from now. So a lot of sort of dates up in the air right now, and hoping to nail those down as soon as we can. I think one thing that I should really point out with relation to that rezone land strategy is another project that I've mentioned a few times here, but we haven't really held any work sessions or talked in too much depth about this. We're talking about the Foothills District Plan. Essentially, the City Council has a goal for this year to essentially begin updating the framework plan for that area that was previously developed in 2012. It was kind of developed and eventually was dismissed, and sort of the project was repealed after some pushback and sort of political issues arose after it was initially adopted. But I think there's a lot of desire amongst the current council to revisit this area of the city and think about the different sort of configurations and uses that could go here. And there's a lot of interesting opportunities. So the Foothills District is about 120 acres that are located between the Willamette River and downtown Lake Oswego. Generally speaking, the previous plan, would have involved the extension of a streetcar from the city of Portland, as well as a fairly dense kind of mixed-use residential commercial typology. I think we are still hoping to activate this area with residential uses in a mixed-use neighborhood, but I don't think we're making too many assumptions about exactly what that will look like quite yet. Generally speaking, though, we are looking at rezoning non-residentially zoned properties. Particularly, there is a mapping of industrial zone in the center of this area that would likely convert to allow some residential use through the framework plan. So this project is also utilizing funding from Metro through their 2040 Planning and Development Grant, which we had been awarded earlier this year. We just concluded our RFP process for this project, or are really close to concluding it, right at the final stages here. So we've announced our intent to award the contract to a consultant team led by a consultant known as First 40 Feet. And we expect to have that sort of contract approved by City Council on June 17th. We actually expect to finalize the contract even sooner than then, of course, and have a little bit of a better sense of this project schedule and scope tasks within the next week or so, really. So things are really starting to move on that project. June is really when things will start commencing. So this will be something that you will be seeing here at the Planning Commission relatively soon. And we're still kind of thinking of what to put on the docket for June 23rd, the commission's meeting then. It might be the case that we will give you a quick update on Foothills during that time, but that is the tentative plan, at least. And we don't have a schedule that reflects that, but that is something that we're at least, it is likely to happen. So anyway, just have to finalize a few things first. Another one that I want to talk about that really we aren't expected to really get underway with until 2027, but it does have a component in 2025, is really to the SDC fee schedule. So this strategy is generally to update our SDC fees so that they are tied more directly to dwelling size and better match sort of what we would charge a development to its actual cost or impact on the system. The sort of first phase of this project we had identified to complete this year. That would be related to cottage clusters. So essentially, the sort of near-term action would be to update the master fee and charges schedule for 2026 to reflect a lower rate per unit for cottage clusters than for single-family homes. It certainly has, or it currently has that same rate as a single-family home. So we're wanting to make this a little bit more reflective of, again, the sort of actual cost or impact on the system and accounting for the smaller size of these units. And then, as I mentioned, we'd really get underway with looking at this in a more broad sense in 2027. All right, it's another one that we've already completed. It's good to check that off, but of course it's still being implemented. It's just something that we had signed up for as part of the HPS that we decided to fast track last year. So this is the nonprofit low-income housing tax exemption. The official sort of action was to adopt this program. Specifically, this is intended to benefit low-income residents by basically alleviating the property tax burden on nonprofit organizations that provide affordable housing at 60% of area median income or less. Basically, we were able to adopt this last year. Again, City Council chose to fast track that, so we were able to adopt that at Council last summer in order to make it available to the Mercy Green Bay development at Merrillhurst Commons. So anyway, it was actually May of last year that we adopted that, and we are continuing to implement that, and we'll be reflecting, the different sort of projects that are able to benefit from this exemption in that midpoint report when we do report back to DLCD. Another one to at least check off the HPS list, if not our list of to-do. So the next strategy I want to talk about is strategy 9. It's the low-income rental housing tax exemption. So it's really quite similar to the nonprofit exemption, except it doesn't apply just to nonprofits. It applies to any development, even those constructed by for-profit developers that is providing housing at or below 60% of AMI. We are intending to begin and complete this work this year, likely in fall of this year, if there are no sort of hiccups in terms of the process and it's approved by City Council as planned. Generally speaking, we expect to do these 3 actions this year. So talk with some other taxing jurisdictions to see if they'd like to be included in the exemption and to gain their approval. Develop some application standards and guidelines to sort of put some barriers, I guess, around what we would want to provide this exemption for. And there are, we can do certain things and we can't do others. So we'll have to understand kind of what's in play when we talk about this more. And eventually, the final action would be to adopt the tax exemption policy at City Council. Again, we expect to do this at least, if not by the end of this year, then by very early in 2026. All right, this is another somewhat complicated strategy. This is the public-private partnerships for affordable housing strategy. The strategy itself is to continue our work that has been ongoing to partner with private entities to develop affordable housing. This one I had explained earlier. We address this relatively in an open-ended manner. I didn't make a ton of commitments because this is something that is not just the city's responsibility. It's kind of an opportunistic type of deal here. So, of course, there are only so many things within the city's control, but we do, think, that we really hope at least that some of these opportunities will come to pass by the time we need to sort of report back to DLCD on this. So, as I mentioned earlier, there was a condition from DLCD related to this strategy that does require us to take action on at least one of the 4 actions that were included as recommendations in our HPS. So you can see those on the screen, either donating city-owned land, surplus land for affordable housing, working with faith organizations to utilize excess or underutilized land for affordable housing, continuing to leverage resources from other jurisdictions to fund affordable housing, and essentially utilizing tax increment financing to support affordable housing partnerships, which is consistent with our TIF strategy, of course. So again, this might be somewhat difficult. We can reach out to faith organizations and talk about things or explore federal, state, and regional resources, but we don't have a ton of surplus city-owned land at this point, and these opportunities are, again, limited. So we'll just have to be we'll have to keep our ears open here and, kind of try to be somewhat, again, opportunistic as we pursue one of these in the next 3 years. Because this is so kind of difficult to understand how the city itself will take action on this, we haven't really recommended a direct course of action. This was presented as an ongoing strategy in the HPS, but that is something we'll have to do in the near future, based on this condition at least.
Eric, can I ask a question
Yeah.
on that one? So by the midpoint, which is end of 2027, correct? The 3-year midpoint?
That is the 3-year midpoint, yeah.
We have to show DLCD that we took action on one of those?
Yes, yeah, and so there's a lot of gray area there, as you might imagine. I think taking action to work with faith-based organizations to utilize their land that could be a very broad thing. So, I think as with a lot of these strategies, actually, we'll probably have to correspond a bit with DLCD to understand a little bit more of the parameters for what we're expected to do here. But there could be some creative ways that we could show that we're working to take one of these actions. And I think particularly with respect to that TIF action, there is a likelihood that we'll be able to take some action in that direction before 2027 or before the end of 2027. So that might be the most practical sort of approach. But again, it's kind of, there's a lot of dates up in the air right now. So we're waiting until some of the bigger projects are more solidified before we can figure out exactly what we're going to do to comply with this. All right, so this strategy is related to TIF, or tax increment financing, and essentially this is a strategy to use TIF to support affordable housing development, and specifically the city is committed to incorporating affordable housing into the eventual urban renewal plan in the Foothills neighborhood that would be eligible for TIF funding as a project. So there's a general sort of purpose to this, but also a specific commitment to utilize TIF within the urban renewal plan in the Foothills neighborhood eventually. What that looks like, again, still somewhat open-ended, will require a lot of work, but we hope that this will all be something that can be completed at the same time concurrently with the adoption of the Foothills under urban renewal plan and other code amendments to implement those planning actions that will be contained in the framework plan. Absolutely, yeah. So I'm going to try to just explain it in a very broad sense. So forgive me if it's too broad. Absolutely. So the concept is really, once you create an urban renewal area pursuant to an urban renewal plan, the taxes more or less are sort of set in stone at that, that sort of initial point of whatever the property tax is at that point. And then over time it increases, as sort of development and other things happen in that area. So the idea is to utilize additional sort of revenue from that baseline level established at the beginning of the urban renewal plan. Anything in terms of tax revenue that's generated, based on additional property value, is then redirected into the district and invested in sort of strategic ways, either in infrastructure or affordable housing. In this case, could be used as sort of investments, TIF investments, I guess. But there are a lot of different approaches that could be taken, and this is something that the city has utilized elsewhere as well. So yeah, there's a great graph that shows you what this looks like, but I don't have it on hand. So it's really just the sort of increment between that sort of base tax level and the increased value that is used. I'm glad that was at least somewhat clear. So yeah, I think one thing that DLCD noted here was that we should clarify the scope of the action in the midpoint report, whether we wanted to just utilize TIF funding for the Foothills neighborhood or to deploy it elsewhere in the city. There could be some opportunities for us to do this elsewhere in the city, so I don't want to assume one way or the other, but our sort of initial plan was just sort of to utilize the Foothills URA for this TIF strategy. All right, so this is the last quote-unquote strategy to address here, and something that we held a work session on actually earlier this year at the Planning Commission. It's related to fair housing policy and education. So the strategy is to amend our comprehensive plan to explicitly make affirmatively furthering fair housing official city policy, and subsequently to take other actions to promote fair housing education, sort of educational campaign. The policy piece is something that we expect to actually both begin and hopefully complete by the end of this year. I think that's supposed to be begin and complete in 2025. And the education, though, is we expect to be a bit of a longer campaign that would extend through 2028. This is something that we actually recommended doing earlier in the process based on feedback from DLCD and our consultant team on the HPS, just to make it clear that this is a lens that we think is important to analyze all the other strategies. So if we have this as a comprehensive plan policy at the outset, when we adopt other strategies, they have to comply with our comprehensive plan, and we'll sort of always be going back and sort of affirming that we are compliant with all of this and that we're moving in the right direction. So that was kind of the idea here, was to establish this as kind of an important value in our work moving forward through adopting it as a comprehensive plan policy. A few things to note is that one of the potential implementation actions that we have identified is actually going to become a requirement in a future housing needs assessment and housing production strategy cycle. So the analysis of impediments to fair housing was something that we identified as a potential action that we could take to further this strategy. As DLCD pointed out in their letter of approval, this is something that we're not going to really have any option about. We're going to be required to do this in the near future. So that's something that, we will sort of undergo according to the DLCD timeline that they provide us and the sort of HPS cycle. Other things that could be deployed for education include trainings about fair housing. Of course, the Planning Commission received a presentation earlier this year from a representative from the Fair Housing Council of Oregon to essentially get that fair housing training as the Planning Commission, but there are a lot of other entities or folks that we could spread that to. It could also involve providing access to fair housing information to individuals that are involved with real estate transactions. So that would be a more targeted deployment of this. And also to really focus on city staff, making sure that they know how to identify potential violations related to fair housing and to be able to make referrals to the Fair Housing Council in those cases. So anyway, that's something, even the education piece is something that we don't want to wait too incredibly long on. It kind of goes hand in hand with the policy. So that's something that, we expect to be able to talk about with council relatively soon. And on July 15th, we're tentatively planning to talk about this, or conduct a similar training, rather, on fair housing with the city council. And there's other things that we can do kind of in the interim, but we're already underway with these things. We are planning to bring forth those comprehensive plan amendments later this year as well to the Planning Commission and City Council. So this should be at least the comp plan amendment piece of this should be a little bit more straightforward with some of the other actions. That was a lot. There are next steps really to every single one of those projects. So I'm really just focusing on the next month or two here. I am hoping, again, this is very tentative, to conduct a work session here at the council, or at the commission rather, on the Foothills project. So I can give you a little bit more information on what we're scoped out to do and what that project schedule looks like. So tentatively putting that on the calendar for June 23rd, and we'll follow up on that. We're also going to need to go to City Council for Foothills a few other times to create a community advisory committee. So that's something that will happen in July. We're also, again, hoping to talk to Council about fair housing on that same day. And we'll be providing a similar update to what we provided to you all tonight on just general HPS implementation to the City Council on August 5th. So that is what we're sort of planning, at least tentatively. Another tentative date is hoping to just bring those really simple comp plan amendments here to discuss on August 11th before we kind of get going with the public hearing process to help us implement that strategy within the year. So again, there's a lot more to talk about here, and we anticipate coming back to you about most every single one of these strategies within the next couple months here. Stay tuned. You will hear a lot more detail on each of these in the near future. Thanks for your time.
Thank you, Eric. I have one question, but if other folks have questions, they can jump on in there. Is it fair to characterize that the Foothills District Plan project has the ability to accomplish multiple strategies all in one sort of work stream, for lack of a better phrase?
Yes, at least two, if not more.
Sure.
But at least portions of two, maybe, I guess would be the best way to say. So maybe the entirety of the TIF strategy, but then just a portion of that rezone land strategy. Mm-hmm. Of course, it really depends on how dense it, of course, like the previous proposal might have just kind of taken all of our deficit away in one fell swoop. I'm not sure we'll get to that level of density this time around, but there's certainly potential for development in that area.
I guess I'm asking for our own, my own, is should I be, when we're doing that, the Foothills District Plan, work stream, should I be trying to tie it back to these strategies in my head? I'm certain you all are doing that, but also be looking at it through that lens as we're doing it to see, when you're making recommendations or thinking about it, it's this could tick 3 boxes.
Yes.
Yeah,
Yeah,
I guess
absolutely.
that's an unfair way to characterize it. It could accomplish 3 required by law strategies.
Right, and I mean, and none of these are easy, so it's not one thing. We're still doing the urban renewal plan anyway, so we should take credit for that as well. Sure. So it's similar to some of the other work that we might be required to do, where we would like to at least incorporate that into our strategy to take credit for that in some way.
Thanks.
You're welcome.
Any other questions on this one? Okay, thank you, Eric, for taking us through what was certainly probably a lot of work to prepare and get to this point, so we appreciate that.
A lot more to come, so I appreciate you being able to at least talk about this at a high level, and we'll have details very, very soon.
We're ready. Item number 8, other business. Do we have any other business? Item number 9, schedule review.
All right, sounds good. I will just really briefly mention, that there are some tentative dates that I've mentioned here, but the next work session is a definite, and we'll be holding that on June 9th. It'll be related to home occupation standards. We're working on that staff report now. Michael has kind of taken a lot of your suggestions into account and developed some options that are intended to address some of the concerns that you had raised at the last meeting, specifically with outdoor activity for home occupations. So that is something that we will be talking about with you on June 9th, in addition to some standards related to what we're calling urban agricultural uses, I guess, or urban agriculture. So things like farm stands and wineries that could be relatively consistent with residential character, but we're trying to think of how to regulate them essentially, and might not be appropriate to consider those home occupations. So we're proposing some other options for you to consider as well. So that's what we'll talk about on June 9th. Again, there could be, we're tentatively planning for a Foothills update on June 23. That could get shuffled around a bit, but we're still at least planning to meet on June 23. And yeah, I think just sort of other things that are likely to, or they're at least solidified right now, are a hearing on the home occupation standards on July 28th, as well as the findings for those on August 11th. So assuming that you're all comfortable at least bringing those forth to a public hearing, that would be the timeline there. And again, unfortunately, there is a lot of scheduling going on right now. So there's a lot of dates that are kind of up in the air, and we will work to get you clarity on those as soon as we can.
Thank you. Any other comments, questions, thoughts? Otherwise, we're adjourned.
Oh, you know what? I actually do have other business. Okay, yeah, it's too late. I was just going to say, unfortunately, there's a recent decision issued, I think it's by the Office of Government Ethics. I forget the exact body, but essentially there's a state-level decision that fortunately makes it at least legally risky and no longer something that we will be doing as a city to provide the commission with refreshments after meetings. So it's a bummer, but I just wanted to let you all know that there is a state decision affecting that practice that will result in us no longer doing that. So.
Yeah, it's called the Oregon Government Ethics Council. They issued an advisory opinion. Unfortunately, we think there's a fix. We can adopt a policy that says that part of the compensation, even though you don't get any compensation, is that we can provide food and beverages. It actually affects staff too. It's not just, so we can't even bring treats to staff meetings anymore. It's ridiculous. So we just want to be aware of it, that we're not not trying to provide you with food.
No wonder I went to look for the cookies and they weren't there.
I'm so sorry. We should have a fix, we hope, in the next month or so. So hang tight. Our intention is to bring back the treats, but we just wanted you to know we're not holding back or anything. Sorry for that.
Something that we had started to do a little bit more recently that, at least helped us have a little social event after these meetings, but not for now. And hopefully we can resume that in the future. But yeah.
Well, now we ended the meeting on a down note, so.
Well, you're not going to get bunt cakes for when you.
We're going to fix it. All right. Now we're adjourned. No more bad news.